tonight. We're talking about Harmon's article on base and superstructure, which I'm sorry, it was kind of a difficult read, but very informative. And I thank Jason for recommending it. So just a quick intro. When we talk about like base and superstructure, essentially what we're talking about is like an abstract or two abstract components of one concept of like that we use to understand how societies develop from stage to stage. So like Marx writes in the preface to a contribution of the critique of political economy that the economic structure of society forms the real basis, which rises a legal and political superstructure. And yeah, it was a long read. Anyway, so the first viewpoint that we look at here is the mechanical materialist viewpoint. And this view sees the base as the forces of production, which inevitably advance and lead to change in society as a whole. And that the political and ideological struggles play no significant role. People are products of circumstance mainly. And this is based off of Marx's quote in The Poverty of Philosophy, which reads, "In acquiring new productive forces, men change their mode of production, and in changing their mode of production and changing their way of earning a living, they change all their social relationships. The handmill gives you a society with a feudal lord. The steam mill gives you a society with an industrial capitalist." Now, this is considered Marxist orthodoxy, and it was adopted by Kautsky. He believed that it was a historical development, produces each mode of production in turn, and thus socialism becomes inevitable. Essentially, capitalism has to give rise to socialism by its very nature of how it produces. This inevitability is derived from the definite stages and modes of production and means that the revolutionary movement cannot alter this development. So to quote the direction from the reading, the direction of social development does not depend on the useful, peaceful methods or violent struggles. It is determined by the progress and needs of the methods of production. If the outcome of a violent revolutionary struggle does not correspond to the intentions of the revolutionary combatants, this only signifies that these intentions stand in opposition to the development of the needs of production. Violent revolutionary struggles can never determine the direction of social development. They can only, in certain circumstances, accelerate their pace. So the goal of revolutionary socialists in this view, under Kautsky's viewpoint here, would be to observe the process, and they should not try to cut short the process itself, but to reflect its development by carefully building up socialist organizations under capitalism until capitalism is ready to organically shift to socialism. And Kautsky insisted that it was impossible for forces of production to regress, which we all know to be apparently untrue, and that economic development will inevitably lead to the conquest of the government in the interests of the working class. Another thinker in this vein of Marxist orthodoxy is Plekhanov, who I've always found kind of like an interesting character. He was the founder of the Russian Social Democratic Movement, who helped introduce Marxist theory to Russia, and that's why I find him interesting. And he largely agreed with Kautsky. He believed that the development of production automatically resulted in the change of the superstructure, and that human endeavor cannot block the development of the forces of production. So in a sense, he was a communist who advocated for capitalism in Russia, thinking that that capitalism would inevitably lead to communism. And the final cause of social relationships lies in the state of productive forces, is something that he asserted. So fundamentally, it was economic development that drives history, and that talented people can only change individual features of events, not the general trend of history itself. Plekhanov's theory was taken up by Stalinists in the 1920s, where the belief that the growth of industry would inevitably lead to a worker state emerged from that ideology. So there was a reaction to this determinism in the 1950s and 60s from the so-called New Left and Maoist left. They attacked the determinist account of history, saying that Marx's writings did not indicate a passive or fatalistic approach to historical change. And Engels actually made remarks in later letters criticizing the overly crude uses of historical materialism. Quotes like this: political, juridical, philosophical, religious, literary, artistic, etc. development is based on economic development. But these all react on one another and also upon the economic basis. It is not that economic situation is the cause solely or solely active, while everything else is only passive in its effect. There is rather an interaction on the basis of economic necessity, which ultimately always asserts itself. So the New Left of the 1950s argued that the base and the superstructure were not literal terms, and that the base does not determine the superstructure in a strict causal relationship, but rather there was an interaction between the two, and it was more of a fluid dynamic. This allowed the New Left of the 1950s to move away from tight definitions of class and dismiss how social being might affect social consciousness. And I think we see a similar shift happening today with the modern left. Such beliefs allow for the fundamentally flawed views that energy and good willpower, with a repudiation of tight categories, can win victory. So to build upon this, E.P. Thompson, a prominent British New Left figure, went so far as to reject economic factors as playing any sort of role in history, or that they could effectively separate the elements of the superstructure from it. The Maoists did not have such an explicit break. So, for instance, Maoist Louis Althusser and his ilk were initially hostile to the New Left, yet they still redefined historical materialism in a similar vein. Although Althusser's earlier writings state the key to change is essentially Stalinist and thus the determinist theory of Planktonov, but there were elements of voluntarism similar to Thompson, and that is an understanding that human will or consciousness can directly impact social outcomes or history, and that human agency is the fundamentally determining force of history, not the forces of production. So Althusser's followers abandoned any notion of determinism ultimately, instead supporting positions that deny any possibility of understanding how a society changes. Post-Althusserian thinkers like Gareth Stedman Jones assert that the only way to understand any ideology is on its own terms. One cannot attempt to interpret its development in the terms of material circumstances of those who adhere to it. And so the convergence of these two groups, the New Left and the Maoists, led to like a common sense, and I say that in scare quotes, belief that the base and superstructure are an outmoded way of examining societal development. This common sense has been accepted by Marxists who actually reject, the conclusions of Thompson and Althusser otherwise. Those who oppose this tendency tend to retreat back to the mechanical interpretation that Kautsky and Planktonov offer. Oh, I'll slow down. Sorry, Ben. Yeah, sorry I talk so fast. Revolutionary Marxist alternative. So there's always been an alternative to this, to either the mechanical or the voluntaristic views and these are offered via the writings of Engels or the Italian Marxist Liberalia or Lenin as well. This view did not become apparent until World War I, and the Russian Revolution proved the bankruptcy of the ideas of Trotskyism. So in this context, Lenin reread Hegel and asserted that intelligent or dialectical idealism is closer to intelligent materialism than stupid or metaphysical materialism. And to kind of try to interpret this into a more plain language, a dynamic dialectical approach to understanding historical processes is more aligned with a sophisticated materialist analysis than any kind of non-dialectical materialism, which would be incapable of accounting for the contradictions or the dynamics that drive and change historical development. From there, Marx kind of lays out his version of historical materialism in German Ideology, which was published in 1846. He begins by recognizing that humans are part of nature, meaning we're biological, and therefore there are activities fundamental to our existence that like sustain us, such as eating, shelter, and those form the precondition for literally everything else. So when we work in the material world, it is to meet these material needs that we have. The activities that we perform, therefore, are dependent on the concrete material situation in which the human being exists, and it's seeking to meet its material needs. So this determines the most basic form of human action and what individuals themselves are like. Marx states that the mode of production must not be considered simply as the reproduction of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity that these individuals, a definite form of expression in their life, and a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, I'm sorry, I lost my place. What they are therefore are doing coincides with the production, both of what they produce and how they produce it. The nature of individuals thus depends on the material circumstances determining their production. So from that, all institutions, ideas, culture, etc., arises from the material reality around us. As Labriola points out, ideas do not fall from heaven and nothing comes to us in a dream, although I'm sure David Lynch would oppose that way of thinking. Humans are distinct from the rest of nature, however, we're a part of nature, but we are distinct from the rest of nature, and that we have the ability to change and develop our material conditions to survive, and we can produce our means of subsistence via physical organization. So by producing subsistence, we are indirectly producing our actual material lives, which is another Marx quote. um, We cannot act independent of our circumstances, but we are not reduced to them. We change our circumstances and we are changed by them. So that brings us to the concept of social production. Production occurs at a societal level and thus needs to be organized socially. Every stage of production has a unique social relation that sustains it. As Marx says, the form of intercourse is again determined by production. Relations emerge out of core productive interaction. To quote again, the fact is that the definite individuals who are productively active in a definite way enter into these definite. Did I just read this? I just read this. I'm sorry. Oh, no, I didn't. Okay. Yeah. So the fact is that these definite individuals who are productively active in a definite way enter into these definite social and political relations. The social structure and the state are continually evolving out of life processes of definite individuals, but of individuals not as they appear in their own or other people's imaginations, but as they really are, i.e., as they operate or they produce materially, and hence as they work under the definite material limitations, presuppositions, and conditions of independent or that are independent to their will. So, our material reality defines what we are ultimately able to produce, and we have relations that emerge out of the interaction of production. Production requires forms of cooperation. These forms of cooperation are the basis of relationships, which provide a framework for everything else and which humans do. The relationship, along with the production and material conditions, provides a limit on what is possible in any society. And the relations of material production not only limit the rest of the relations within society, they are the source of content of the wider relationships as well. So societies develop through changes in production and changes in the relationship between human beings in the productive process, which in turn will exert pressure on all other social systems. So now we're going to talk briefly about exploitation in the superstructure. For the force of production to develop beyond a certain point, exploitation becomes necessary, and this is because the surplus must be controlled by a small privileged minority, the bourgeoisie, in order to because otherwise, if it were spread out to meet material needs, it would not be able to be invested into developing the means of production. And so the exploiting group thus must establish special bodies of armed men to safeguard its wealth, and must gain control of religion and culture broadly to assert itself and its ideology. The exploiting group creates a network of non-productive relationships to safeguard its privileged position. Thus, we see the non-economic superstructure emerge to protect the bourgeoisie or any exploiting class's position within their historical stage of development. And this puts a limit on the changes in relations of production, even if it may stop the further development of productive forces. And we especially see this before capitalism, but there are qualities to capitalism that prevents this from necessarily being the case in capitalism. The superstructure's impact on the base is central to a Marxist approach. It allowed Marx to talk about successive distinct modes of production as stages in history, which is kind of what I've been trying to get at through this whole presentation, in which the organization of production and exploitation is static during each stage and allows the ruling class to mold society to fit its needs. So Marxism does not see political struggle simply as an automatic passive reflection of development of productive forces. It is economic development that produces the class forces that struggle for control in a society. But how that struggle goes depends on the mobilization of each political class within the structure itself. So the key role of changes in production. Marx asserts that to insist every influence, assert that everything influences everything else in a society leads nowhere. And this is in criticizing Proudhon. He asserts his position that the production of relations of a society form a whole. Proudhon considers economic relations as so many social phases engendering on one another, resulting from the other. The only drawback to this method is when he comes to examine a single one of these phases, he cannot explain it without having recourse to all the other relations of society, which relations he has not made his dialectical movement engender. So Proudhon's view, the view that Marx is criticizing here, it becomes impossible to examine any individual component within society since they're all interacting with each other constantly, and any kind of useful method of analysis can't be derived because it needs to look at both the whole and individual components to be useful. So without the ability to analyze the discrete factors, all analysis becomes completely abstract in that situation. Marx proposed the consequences of viewing society as an indistinct mass or whole would be that one can view society as eternal and unchanging. One can it can lead to the belief that like the dynamic force of society is mystical in origin and outside of society's control itself, which we see in Hegel's concept of the world spirit. And it can lead to a view that what exists today can only be grasped in its own terms without referencing anything else. So to avoid those pitfalls, Marx focuses on one element in the social whole that tends to develop itself, which is the forces of production. Past labor provides the means for increasing the output of present labor, both in the means of production via tools, machines, automation, because labor creates these things, and also through new knowledge and adapting new ways of working, which humans also then adapt to new ways of relating to each other. Changes in production are the dynamic way by which society changes, while individual leaders and cultural figures are accidental and cannot assure any kind of cumulative change in society. So meaning like cultural changes build upon, changes in productions build upon themselves, while we can't rely on just like the great man theory, one person asserting themselves in order to change society as a whole. So even though we see societies may regress sometimes, the development of productive forces can be viewed as the exception, not the norm. It does not invalidate Marx's arguments, because where those forces of production break through, the societies thrive and eventually dominate societies where the forces of production have been stifled. And we see that with capitalism, the emergence of capitalism over mercantilism or feudalism. Therefore, the superstructure always rests on the base of material production. If the superstructure attempts to prevent the base from developing itself, the superstructure dooms itself. As Engels said, the economic element finally asserts itself. So we talk not about changes in production, but changes in society and how they react or relate to the base and superstructure. So a lot of the confusion over the base and superstructure emerge from the preface of the Critique of Political Economy, and it's due to a failure to recognize that there are two distinctions involved in the base and superstructure. There's a distinction within the base between the forces of production and the relations of production, and there's a distinction between the relations of production and social relations. But both the forces of production and the relations of production are what constitute the base. They're one whole element in two components. It is impossible to separate material production from the social relations involved. If new ways of working involve new social relations, then they must come into existence simultaneously to social relations. And then the distinction of the base, that is to say, the distinction between the forces of production and the relations of production, have priority over the distinction between the base and the superstructure. To say that the distinction of the base directly affects the superstructure, so changes in forces lead to changes in relations, which in turn have to lead to changes in the relationships of societies, such as changes in our institutions, laws, culture, religion, etc., which are necessary to reproduce the economic relationships. The purpose of these distinctions is to understand how society changes. That's the general goal of this whole presentation, is we're trying to develop a method to understand how societies develop. So some argue that the relations of productions can be reduced to property relations, but this is an incredibly limited notion of the social relations of production. Like Marx's accounts of history on small changes in forces of production leading to small changes in social relations until the changes or until they challenge a wider relation of society. But these changes might involve property relations, but in many important cases we see that they do not. And like we could say that's true of how, or like the internet boom changed our forces of production, but didn't fundamentally change the way that we view property. We can also see this in modern society where there are changes in production changes in production methods in capitalist countries, but we do not see a fundamental change in the property relations with those changes in production. So under capitalism, the base and superstructure, the capitalist survives by expanding their forces of production more rapidly than their rivals. which is distinct from the previous stages of historical development. This occurs by increasing the ratio of investment compared to the workforce. So the investment grows faster than labor. And this creates a contradiction because it causes rates of profit to fall, since workers are the source of profit. And Marx asserts that this leads to stagnation of the system and greater economic disparity and crisis. The surplus value generated by labor gives rise to a secondary economic layer, which relates to the distinct distribution of surplus value vis-a-vis commodity trading, credit systems, and stock markets. This layer demonstrates that the economic activity extends beyond the production and enters into the superstructure, interacting with politics and society more broadly than production itself. However, this distribution layer is fundamentally linked to production because it trades on the surplus value derived from production. So finally, we get to superstructure and the ideology. Marx claims that ideas arise out of the material interactions of human beings, as we've established. We set out from real active men. On the basis of this, we demonstrate that the development of ideological reflexes and the echoes of this life's processes. The phantoms of the human brain are necessarily sublimates of men's life processes, which can be empirically established and which are bound to material preconditions. And knowledge is a social product arising out of the need to communicate and carry out social production. So consciousness is the subjective expression of objectively existing relationships, Marx says. This brings us to the concept of false consciousness. So immediate awareness is when an individual is directly engaged in the activity and possesses a consciousness of their actions. Since it is directly tied to a physical activity, it aligns with reality and is unlikely to give way to false or to be false and gives a tangible, immediate experience that is based in. And there's the concept of general consciousness, which builds, on this idea. General consciousness is beyond immediate awareness. It is the contextualization of immediate awareness within a broader framework. For instance, your general consciousness may be aware that you are laboring to earn a living and incorporates your beliefs, values, and also social narratives. General consciousness may not be reliable or truthful because it is abstract and it is subject thus to influence and distortions from things like political propaganda or one's economic conditions or the economic conditions in which one is operating. For instance, one can labor all day under the assumption that they will be paid at the end of the day, but there is always the chance they will not be paid due to the economic conditions. So this leads to false generalizations. There's a tendency, especially in philosophy, to think abstractly, which I think we've done quite a bit tonight, and thus be a bit removed from material reality, which leads to consciousness that lacks any practical understanding. And this arises from the divorce between theory and practice. So then false consciousness itself is a state of mind which prevents an individual or group from recognizing the reality of the economic or social situation at hand. And the bourgeoisie perpetuates its value system under the superstructure, leading to false consciousness. Some examples of this would be the idea that we don't have class interests, right? That our interests are nationally based, or a meritocracy, or that consumerism is necessary. So the central role this all plays in class struggle. The Marxist approach begins by pointing out the contradictory ways in which the forces of production and the relations of productions develop. And the resolution of this contradiction can only take place through class struggle. The advance of any new mode of production is always marked by bitter class war. It creates a situation of near equality between the forces of the oppressor and the forces of the oppressed, or the rival classes. And there are still dependent factors outside of economic development, ideological homogeneity. There are still dependent factors outside of that economic development, such as our ideological homogeneity. So like our, ideological consistency, the level of our organization, and the development of our leadership, et cetera. So as new forms of activity develop and are suppressed, the rising class can either concede to the pressures of the old order and cease their new forms of activity, or they generalize their class with the old ideology, developing out of the elements of their new worldview, which they all rally behind in their similar objectives. So this new system of ideas isn't a passive reflection of economic changes, but a key link in the process of social transformation, mobilizing those seeking to change their social relations in their entirety. Now, what's the role of the party here? We must relate to people whose everyday struggle leads them to challenge certain tenets of capitalism and the transformation that ideological struggle and transform their ideological struggle into a practical one. And we must translate theory into practice and practice back into theory with a clear set of ideas that challenge the old ideology and take it to its logical conclusions. At a certain stage, this coalesces into a party which mobilizes people in order to tear the old superstructure apart.